Thank you, Adam, and I cannot tell you how honored and excited I am to be at this conference. Ron Paul has served as a real inspiration for me in my life, and the Ron Paul Institute is just such a fantastic organization. Some people say to me sometimes, well, all you're doing is just preaching to the choir. And I say, yeah, isn't that great? So it's really nice to be here with you to share ideas on liberty. On the 4th of July in 1821, John Quincy Adams delivered a remarkable speech to the members of Congress. The speech is entitled, "In Search of Monsters to Destroy." And what Adams said is that he says, look, there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world. There's dictatorships, there's tyranny, there's starvation, famines, civil wars, conflicts, discord, wars between countries. But in outlining the structure of government that had been called into existence by the Constitution some 30 years before, Adams said that this is a country whose government does not go abroad in search of these monsters and striving to destroy them and saving people from them. Instead, he said, this is a country that is going to be devoted to a limited government republic and whose society, whose people, whose country is going to be establishing a model society of freedom and peace and prosperity for the world to emulate. Adams was drawing on the ideas of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who had talked against the concept of allying with America with other countries, automatically coming to the defense of other countries, entangling alliances, as they called it. They said that America will have a peaceful, prosperous society with free commerce with the rest of the world. Now, Adams said that if America ever abandons this role of a limited government republic and decides to start going abroad in search of these monsters to destroy, that it would fundamentally alter the character of the government, the federal government, and that it would fundamentally alter the character of American society. He said America will become like a dictatress, and with the implication of the government exercising powers that are inherent to totalitarian dictatorships. Now, if we jump ahead about 140 years, we come across another remarkable speech. This one was by the former Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in World War II. A man who understood military establishments. This was President Dwight Eisenhower. And this is in 1961, where Eisenhower is getting ready to leave the presidency. John Kennedy's coming in. And Eisenhower is giving his farewell address, his message to the American people. And he says, something has changed in this country. The federal government has changed. It has become what has become known as a national security state. He called it a military-industrial complex. His original term that he planned to use was a military-industrial congressional complex. Okay. Massive military establishment, bases domestically all over the world. Why was this significant? Well, because a national security state is characteristic of a dictatorial regime. The Soviet Union was a national security state. Communist China today is a national security state. North Korea is a national security state. Cuba is a national security state. And so Eisenhower was pointing out this phenomenon. So how did this happen? Well, it turns out that after World War II, U.S. officials said that it's necessary for America to become a national security state in order to combat the Soviet Union, which was a national security state. in the Cold War. The Soviet Union had become, which had been, ironically, America's World War II partner and ally, was now declared to be the new official enemy. And so they said it's necessary for America to adopt the same type of governmental structure that the communist regime is adopting in order to defeat them. Here was the origin of the regime change operations. 1953 Iran, which we're still living with. 1954 Guatemala, which developed the same type of 30 years of civil war that is developed in Syria and Libya and other places in the Middle East. Here was the genesis of the assassination program that has now become an integral part of the U.S. government. The CIA-Mafia partnership to assassinate Fidel Castro, who never attacked the United States or even threatened to do so. Later, the CIA becomes a partner in an operation called Operation Condor in Latin America under Augusto Pinochet, who they installed into power under another regime change operation that killed tens of thousands of innocent people. Here was the genesis of the torture program, MK-Ultra, that involved medical experimentation on innocent Americans. But you see, they said that it was going to be temporary, that it was only going to last as long as the Cold War lasted, which of course they thought would go on forever. But as soon as the Cold War was over, then America's status as a republic, a constitutionally limited republic, could be restored. Except for one thing. That when the Cold War unexpectedly came to an end in 1989, the national security establishment by this time had become the most powerful, the most influential part of the federal government. They were bound and determined not to go out of existence. And so they developed a strategy designed to provoke crises, to justify their existence. That's what NATO's movement toward the Russian borders was all about. To create that crisis, knowing full well that the reaction of Russia to U.S. troops on their border was going to be no different than when Soviet troops were coming to America's borders when they entered Cuba in 1962. And it's fitting that this conference is one day before the anniversary of 9/11, because what they did after the demise of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, they began going into the Middle East and killing people. And there were some of us that told them, you can see our articles at the Future of Freedom Foundation before 9/11. We were telling them that if you keep killing people in the Middle East, you're going to see major terrorist retaliation on American soil. We weren't the only ones. Chalmers Johnson, the man who's written this fantastic trilogy of books on U.S. imperialist foreign policy, he said the same thing in his great book, Blowback, that was published before 9/11. If you don't stop killing people in the Middle East, you're going to have a terrorist attack on American soil. And it didn't take a genius to come up with this. There had been the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. There had been the attacks on the USS Cole and on embassies in East Africa. And every time the terrorists said, it's because of the fact that you're killing people. Your government's killing people here in the Middle East. And then you have the infamous statement by Madeleine Albright, who is the official spokesman for America to the United Nations under the Clinton administration, when she's asked, are the deaths of 500,000 children, Iraqi children, that you people have killed in Iraq, is it worth it? Is it worth regime change? And her answer, which reverberated throughout the Middle East, was, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. And so when 9/11 hits, they hit us with this nonsense, oh, they just hate us for our freedom and values, rather than accepting responsibility for what they had wrought with their interventionism. And then they double down. They don't pull the troops back, like Reagan did, wisely, in Lebanon, when the terrorists attacked U.S. troops at that barracks and killed hundreds of them. Reagan says, pull them out. But they didn't do that. They doubled down. They sent troops into Afghanistan with a regime change operation there. Not just to capture bin Laden, but to effect a regime change against a regime that had refused to comply with Bush's unconditional extradition demand for bin Laden, despite the fact that the two countries did not even have an extradition agreement. And then they used 9/11 as the excuse and the bogus WMDs to achieve what the sanctions that had killed all those children had not achieved. Regime change encompassing the ouster of Saddam Hussein from power. And so when Eisenhower's giving this farewell address, he's saying to the American people that this fundamental change constitutes a grave threat to the freedom, prosperity, and democratic processes, the rights and liberties of the American people. He was echoing what the Founding Fathers said when they said, we stand for a republic. We stand for a government that does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. It was Madison who crafted the Constitution, who said of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest. Because it encompasses all the rest, the out-of-control spending, the debt, the taxes, and the assaults on liberty. And so it is that we now live under a government that Adams was talking about, a dictatress, a government that wields direct dictatorial powers. There's no other way to put it. I mean, you've got a government whose president has the authority to assassinate everybody in this room. The legal authority. Upheld by the Supreme Court. That's incredible. This is what Adams was talking about. You've got a government that has the authority, the legal authority to take everybody in this room into custody, put them in a concentration camp, and torture them with immunity. That is not a free society. That is the type of society that Adams was talking about. Now, that all sounds like really depressing. I mean, and then look, you look at the presidential race. I mean, when you've got a public official, a president, a ruler of a country that has this type of power, dictatorial power, it doesn't bode well when the two choices, the major party choices, are among two people who are among the most vicious, mean-spirited people you would ever find in life. That doesn't bode well for a people that are suffering under that type of dictatorial power. If you have to live under a dictatorship, you're much better off with a nice person that's wielding those powers. Now, where does that leave us? Because, I mean, it's easy to start prescribing some cyanide capsules here. The Los Angeles Times a few weeks ago published a remarkable op-ed by a woman named Elizabeth Cobbs who teaches at Texas A&M. It's really worth reading this op-ed. It's a fantastic op-ed on the founder's vision of a non-interventionist foreign policy. But in that op-ed, that she cited a remarkable statistic that I was not aware of. She said that the Pew Research Foundation has found that 57% of the American people now favor no longer meddling in the affairs of other countries. That's an amazing statistic, and the Pew Research Center said that it's up by about like 5 or 6% over the last 3 or 4 years. And so if we can keep building that number from 57% to 62% to 70%, all of a sudden we're looking at bringing together a critical mass, one of those critical masses of people that occur in history that all of a sudden brings a monumental shift to a new paradigm, a paradigm of freedom, peace, and prosperity. Now, when you imagine this, if we were to pull all the troops out of the Middle East, and preferably the rest of the world, you're talking about a major transformation in American society. You're talking about anti-American terrorism disappearing because it has nothing to do with the Muslims, the Islam, the caliphates, and all that nonsense. It has everything to do with interventionism. You bring the troops home, and all of a sudden the anti-American terrorism is gone. Now, it's the same thing with Vietnam. When we finally got the troops out of Vietnam, there's not one single instance of where the Vietnamese retaliated. And if anybody had any justification for retaliating, but not one of them retaliated with a terrorist strike. It was over. If you combine that with ending the war on drugs, which is clearly teetering. I mean, I've never seen more articles and more editorials in the mainstream press from people calling for an end to the war on drugs. The feds are not even enforcing their own drug laws in states that have legalized marijuana, which is incredible. They're releasing people. They're releasing people from prison early. They're acknowledging the brutality of this war. And imagine what would happen if all of a sudden that thing goes right now in the near term, where drugs are legalized. No more muggings and robberies and burglaries and theft that are associated with getting the money to pay the exorbitant black market prices for drugs. No more gang wars because the gangs are out of business immediately. No more cartel fights. None of the violence that is associated with the war on drugs. If we legalize drugs, if we bring the troops home, you are talking about a sea change in American society toward peace and prosperity and harmony. And then people start asking, well, if we have this peace, prosperity, and harmony, what do we need this totalitarian-like apparatus known as the national security establishment? And then we're on the road to where we want to get. And so how does that happen? Well, that's what you're about. That's why you're here. You're here for the same reason I'm here. Because you want that kind of society in your lifetime before you pass. You want to know what it's like to live the life of a free man, a free woman. And that comes through the power of ideas. Ideas on liberty. Okay, the political world is fine, but that's not where the real happening takes place. They're more of a reflection of what's going on in society. Here is where it is. There's a reason why totalitarian dictatorships shut conferences like this down. They know the power of ideas on liberty to transform people. The responsibility lies with you to continue sharing articles that you find with other people. Forward them. To stand for your beliefs when you're talking to friends and neighbors. That if through that rippling out effect, through the power of ideas, that society is transformed. If we do that, if every person in this room does that, you become the new founding fathers of a new America. America based on freedom, peace, and prosperity. You lead the world, and America leads the world to the most peaceful, prosperous, and harmonious and moral society and free society that mankind has ever seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bumper. That was really inspiring. We're going to have some time to take a few questions. Slightly inconveniently, and I apologize, we simply have a microphone here. So if someone would like to ask Mr. Hornberger a question in the few minutes we have left, please feel free to stand up and do so. Again, I do apologize for it being slightly inconvenient, but we do have a customer. Make sure it's on.
Okay, hello.
Oh. A little.
Hello. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing speech and very inspiring at the end. So you guys a few years ago, probably 10, 12, 15, did a couple years in a row of a foreign policy gathering like this for one day. Had just killer speakers, banged out like 15 speakers in a matter of 6-7 hours. It's just amazing. How do we get those conferences back?
Yeah, he's talking about two of the most fantastic conferences we ever put on in 2007, 2008 on this theme of foreign policy and peace and prosperity. And the line of speakers we had, all the videos are online. I highly recommend them. They're timeless videos. We had people like Stephen Kinzer and Andrew Basevich and Jonathan Turley and Lou Rockwell and many, many others. But one of the highlights of this thing was that our two dinner speakers were Ron Paul and Andrew Napolitano. And you could just feel the energy developing. And it's my understanding, I could be wrong, but I think that's when the two of them met for the first time. And it was just the most awesome evening. I mean, it was just, there was so much excitement. And so, yeah, we've put on smaller programs since then. We haven't put on this huge 3-day conference. And maybe we'll do it again. I mean, when you see the kind of outpouring of support for these types of ideas, this is so encouraging. And that's really what I think the libertarian organizations need to be doing, is focusing on this issue. This, to me, is the burning issue of our time. Over and above the welfare state, the Federal Reserve, all of which are important, the drug war, this is the one that is the root that is taking away our freedom and our prosperity. Yeah, thank you, Walt. Yeah.
Come to the microphone, please, if you have a question.
Hi, thank you. That was a great speech.
Thank you.
I don't understand, and this is also for Representative Massey, that we're $19.6 trillion in debt. We're financially insolvent as a country. I don't understand how we can keep spending money to the tune of billions of dollars, taking over these countries and murdering their citizens. The financial math just doesn't add up. How do the people in Congress or anywhere not see that we're broke? And minus the moral argument that you brought up, Madeleine Albright murdering 500,000 children in Iraq, minus the moral, just the financial, I don't understand why that doesn't come up in Congress more often. Why isn't that talked about? We just can't afford financially to do these things. So any comments you have, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head in terms of financial issues and monetary issues. They are bankrupting the government, which is bankrupting America. Let me tell you something. This is not going to end well. I mean, I would tell you, brace yourself, because I think that what you saw in 2008 with the crash, that's going to be child's play. To me, that's just the tremor before the earthquake. We've seen it in Greece. We've seen it in Puerto Rico. We've seen it in American cities that outspend their revenues. You cannot spend more than you take in for an indefinite period of time. You cannot accumulate massive amounts of debt without it finally collapsing the country from within. And that's what's happening, is that you've got the massive welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, aid to dictators, the whole thing. And nobody's going to let go of his dole over here. You've got the national security state. They're not willing to let go of their dole. They don't want to let go of their bombings and their killings. So we're stuck. I mean, there's no way out. And as you point out, Kyle, the amount of debt continues to rise, and it is discussed in Congress. Every time the debt ceiling is reached, they have these bogus discussions and debates, and then they just raise the debt ceiling and keep piling on. And notice that every time they raise the debt ceiling, nobody says, hey, we need to shut down the spending now. They just start all over again. This is not going to end well. And it could be very vicious, especially if you have a perfect storm of terrorism, foreign policy, Russia, China, where they're ginning up crises, and a monetary crisis, where there's a huge crash in the dollar, where the population cannot sustain the burden of the taxes and debt that comes with the warfare state. I think we're looking at something really bad on the horizon. I would say, yeah, brace yourself for it.
Hello, Mr. Hornberger.
Hi, Laura.
Hi. I'm wondering, what would you say to the people who now think that non-interventionism is the way to go. They concede that in the past we shouldn't have intervened and it was wrong, but say that now because we have intervened and there's instability or power vacuums or whatever, that we have to maintain presence there to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, it's sort of like pouring gasoline on the fire that you've created. They really make the situation worse. I mean, look what they've done in the Middle East. They've killed untold numbers of people. They've been killing people for 25 years. I mean, it really is incredible. And then they produce this massive refugee crisis. And they say, oh, okay, what are you libertarians going to do about this crisis? Well, libertarians never pretend to solve the problems that statism produces. I mean, we set the platform for a free, prosperous, and harmonious society. But when you've done so much damage, when this government's done so much damage, the best thing to do is stop doing any more damage. They have this mindset that, oh, well, now we'll fix, as you point out, we're going to fix what we've already done. And you see that in Syria, and you see it in Libya, and you see it in Iraq, and they just make it worse. They continue to kill more people, and in the process, they use that as the excuse to take away our freedoms here at home. That's what the NSA is about, the FISA court, all the FBI activity, it's all to keep us safe from the horror that they're producing overseas. The best thing that can be done is, like I said, what happened with Vietnam. I mean, here the U.S. invades Vietnam, a country that had never attacked the United States, and creates untold misery and suffering with napalm and death and destruction. I mean, was it unfortunate that they were involved in a civil war? Yeah. Was it unfortunate that it was a communist regime that was winning? Yeah. But that doesn't make it America's business or the business of the U.S. government. But as soon as the troops are withdrawn, then all of a sudden, okay, the communists win. That's not a really satisfactory solution. But everything just restores. There's sort of a harmony that's developed now where there's peaceful coexistence today with Vietnam, even to the point where the Pentagon's practically begging them to put bases there in a perverse form of friendship. And so that's what we need to do, is just bring all the troops home immediately from everywhere, Korea, Africa, Latin America, Europe. Bring them all home and let them sit at their desks, And then I would say discharge them, but at the very least, you're no longer pouring fuel on the fire. So, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bumper. That was terrific. Couple of things.